Captain's Quarters, 11:50 p.m. Captain Smith had been awakened from the first decent night's sleep he had since the killings began. "What is it, son?" Smith asked the young seaman standing at his cabin door. "We've struck a berg, sir," the boy explained. "Mr. Murdoch requests your presence on the bridge at once." The captain gave the young man a curious glance. "Struck an iceberg, you say?" "Yes, sir, just moments ago." "I felt nothing." "It wasn't serious, sir, just a scrape." Smith instinctively reached for his captain's hat. He dropped his feet into his shoes, wrapped himself in a thick coat, and headed for the bridge. The ship appeared to be sound. "Which side of the ship did the berg strike?" Smith asked. He and the young seaman exited the officers' quarters corridor, out onto the deck. The young man had to run, keeping in step with his worried superior. "Starboard side, sir." "Damn," Smith said under his breath. The captain was doing his best to remain calm. Upon reaching the bridge, Smith found it to be in a state of chaos. Smith motioned to Boxhall to follow him out onto the starboard bridge wing. "Mr. Boxhall, you will stay with me." Boxhall, who had been helping Murdoch with damage reports, silently looked at the first officer to see if he protested. There was no reply. "Coming, sir." Smith peered over the bridge wing, trying to see if he could catch a glimpse of the iceberg. There was nothing for him to see. Again, the captain cursed. "Where's the ship's carpenter?" Smith asked, rubbing a worried hand across his beard. "Shall I fetch him, sir?" "Immediately." Boxhall rushed off the bridge, following his captain's orders. Smith, seeing no sign of the iceberg, returned to the bridge, finding all his officers looking at him. "Stop all engines, Mr. Murdoch," Smith ordered. "I think we should stay put until the ship is pronounced sound." "Sir," Murdoch replied. Silently pointing to the quartermaster, the first officer passed on his captain's request. The quartermaster took hold of the engine's telegraph, motioning the indicator to stop. The engine room responded in kind, returning the order with a ringing bell. "All engines stop, sir," the quartermaster said. The rhythmic throbbing of the Titanic suddenly started to die down. Everyone on the bridge could feel it. The ship was dead in the water. "Sir, I have found the carpenter," Boxhall shouted. Smith got the impression that his sixth officer had dragged the man out of his bunk. The ship's carpenter reported to his captain with a tired salute. The man was barely able to regain his professional composure. "Reporting as ordered, sir." "Sir, the ship has been struck by an iceberg," the captain explained. The ship's carpenter's eyes showed concern. "Sir?" "I wish for you to sound the ship, discover the damage caused by this encounter, then bring your findings to me. With any luck, we'll be ready to get underway in about an hour." "I shall do my best, sir." "Indeed you shall." With a click of his heels, the carpenter rushed off the bridge. "Quartermaster!" Smith shouted. Leaving another officer at the wheel, the quartermaster stepped forward. "Yes, sir." "Do you know where Mr. Andrews is bunking?" "I think so, sir." "Find him," Smith demanded. "We need his input here." The young quartermaster looked back at his station. Smith could sense the man's desire to remain at his post and for a second admired the young officer's sense of duty. "Move it, mister!" Smith shouted. "Sir." Smith watched the quartermaster run off the bridge. After the first 10 minutes of impact, water started to rise 14 feet above the ship's keel forward. The first 5 compartments began to take on water. After his inspection, the ship's carpenter brought the captain bad news. A deck, Suite A36, 11:55 p.m. Andrews heard a knock at his door, waking him from a restful sleep. He found himself in his chair with several blueprints on his lap and rubbed his eyes, trying to focus them in the dark. "Come in," he said. Shoving the door open, the quartermaster rushed in. "Mr. Andrews, the captain wishes to see you on the bridge." Andrews could feel it. The ship was no longer under power. "Why have the engines stopped?" he demanded. "We've struck an iceberg." "When did this happen?" "About 20 minutes ago, sir." Andrews grabbed his blueprints and followed the quartermaster to the bridge. April 15th, 1912. Bridge, 12 o'clock a.m. Upon reaching the bridge, Kotz knew that something was wrong. He had returned to his room after confirming several autopsies with the ship's doctor and was awakened by a curious bump that seemed to vibrate through the entire ship. At first, the detective thought that the sudden movement was an explosion. However, upon further investigation, he began to feel differently. The detective noticed Smith pacing back and forth on the starboard bridge wing and was practically knocked off his feet by Ismay, who, upon entering the bridge, started to ask questions. "I demand to know why this ship has stopped." "I'm sounding the ship," Smith stated. "Sounding?" Ismay asked. "For what reason?" "We've struck an iceberg." Ismay filled the bridge with an arrogant laugh. This laugh, Kotz observed, received a cold stare from almost every Titanic officer. "I'm glad that you find this amusing, sir," Murdoch shouted. "This ship could be severely damaged." "Not the Titanic." Smith stopped Ismay's bragging. "The carpenter has informed us of a major leak in the forward areas." "How bad a leak?" "Serious enough, Mr. Ismay." Smith's voice had a warning tone to it. "We may need the use of the lifeboats." Kotz started to regret his voyage on the Titanic. "Now, just a minute," Ismay barked. "Aren't you rushing things here?" "To make sure, I have sent for Mr. Andrews. I shall await his opinion before I take further actions," Smith said, doing his best to calm Ismay down. Everyone noticed the fear growing in Bruce Ismay's eyes, but none had the tact to question him. Kotz saw the captain giving him a curious stare. "Mr. Kotz," Smith motioned Kotz with a finger. "Would you come here?" Kotz walked over, taking his notepad out of his vest pocket. The detective wanted to inform Smith of the doctor's findings on the autopsies, but the seasoned lawman knew that this was never to be. Smith's brow seemed to carry more serious troubles than that of a loathsome murderer. "Captain," Kotz tried to reply, "I have just spoken with the doctor, and he informs me that none of the victims—" "That's fascinating, Mr. Kotz," Smith interrupted. "Would you be so kind as to escort Mr. Ismay back to his suite?" Kotz let out a disagreeable grunt. "I'd rather he didn't, if you don't mind," Ismay insisted. The detective noticed the look of disgust he was receiving from the company executive. "Oh, how I hate this man," Kotz thought. "I'd give 20 years of my life to prove that he was our killer and not this damn mummy." The supernaturalist sighed. This pampered ass wouldn't have the balls to boil milk, let alone slosh a man's throat. Ismay gave Kotz a hard eye, saying, "I mean, really, doesn't he ever change his clothes?" Kotz noted the anger growing in the captain's eyes. The detective started to appreciate the respect Smith was starting to show him and regarded it as the proudest professional relationship he had ever known. "Mr. Ismay, must I remind you who's in command here?" Smith warned. "You will keep a civil tongue as long as I am on this bridge." Ismay huffed, not at all pleased at being put in his place. "To be escorted by a commoner. It is unheard of." Kotz grunted, amused. "Captain Smith, I would consider it an honor to escort Mr. Ismay." Kotz gave the captain a wink as he dragged a cursing Ismay off the bridge. Lightoller walked up to his captain, bringing him the latest damage reports. "What of the inspector's investigation, sir?" "That, Mr. Lightoller, is beyond my concern at the moment. I have my ship to consider." F deck, third-class cabins, 12:05 a.m. "Fight all you wish, ship. It is my intentions to make sure that you die," Ka-Ray raged. Ka-Ray tore open sealed portholes, allowing the dark green waters of the North Atlantic to pour in at her feet. "You paid no heed to the warnings at my tomb," she pointed out, beating the ship's walls as she continued her destructive trek. "Warnings inscripted by my hand, authored by my intention not to be disturbed. In killing you, ship, I kill those who have ignored the will of the gods." Ka-Ray walked through the halls of the lower decks, not caring who saw her. Screams from frightened women filled the corridors. Corridors, though grandiose in their designs, cared not for their inhabitants' comforts. "Send your men, great Pharaoh Captain. I await your test. Let your chariots attack me." "Stop!" a man shouted. Ka-Ray saw a young man holding a weapon at her. Ka-Ray couldn't understand the device, but she knew it to be dangerous. With water trailing at their feet, both figures stood watching the other. "You will stop what you are doing now," the young man warned. "You do not scare me, little boy," Ka-Ray silently challenged. "There is nothing you can do to me that hasn't already been done." Ka-Ray's face twisted with a perverted delight as she pushed her fingers through the man's rib cage, pulling out his heart. Screams echoed through the hall. An old woman fainted. A priest started to pray. Ka-Ray handed the bloody organ back to its owner and continued her trek down the port side of the ship, knocking out the Titanic's portholes. The Irishman dropped his gun, vomiting black blood through his screaming mouth. Captain's Quarters, 12:10 a.m. Captain Smith paced the floor of his cabin as Thomas Andrews looked over his blueprints. He had only one question to answer. Was the Titanic safe to sail? Andrews was the only authority on board who knew enough about the Olympic-class vessel to respond to this issue. The captain had no need to press an answer. He could see it in the man's face. Andrews placed his slide rule on Smith's desk and said rather absent-mindedly, "I cannot believe this." "What?" Andrews wouldn't answer. Instead, he silently shook his head no. "Mr. Andrews, tell me what's going on, please." Andrews started to draw several dots across the blueprints of the Titanic. Smith watched with interest. "The berg that hit us certainly was a calculating bitch. She knew how to sink us." Smith glared at Andrews. His jaw tightened. "Yes, Captain," Andrews confirmed. "We are done for." "How?" Smith asked, his voice pleading for an answer. "Why?" "As the iceberg scraped our starboard side, she bounced off the hull, popping the rivets holding us together." Andrews paused, thinking. "It's also entirely possible that the colliding berg breached the keel." "Then there is nothing we can do to stop the flooding." Andrews said, "Not even God could save this ship." "I do not understand," Smith shouted. A lost look of hurt entered the captain's eyes. Andrews studied the pain and understood. "Look here, sir." The shipbuilder started to draw a straight red line through the Titanic's forward sections. "Water in the forepeak, number 1 hold, number 2 hold, the mail room, boiler room number 6, and boiler room 5. The facts, let alone the oncoming water, show several punctures throughout the ship's hull. Or, if you prefer, a 300-foot gash, leaving the first 5 compartments hopelessly flooded." Smith still did not want to accept the situation. "This ship is supposed to be unsinkable," Smith pointed out. "You promised that fact to all the world." "I did nothing of the kind. In worst-case scenario, she was designed to stay afloat for 3 days. I promised a sound ship." "Sound ship, is it? She sinks like a rock." These words hit Andrews hard. Long ago, he punched a man in the mouth for uttering those words to him. Once, men praised him for it. Would they praise him now? "Look, sir," Andrews tried to explain, biting back his own pain. "The Titanic could float with any 2 of her 16 watertight compartments flooded. She could float with 3 of the first 5 compartments flooded. She could even float with the first 4 entirely gone." Smith studied the blueprints, paying attention to the red marks the shipbuilder had been marking. "Not with the first 5 altogether?" Smith asked. "Correct," Andrews insisted, realizing that he was getting through. "The 5th watertight compartment only goes as high as E-deck. After that, the bow sinks below the waterline, causing the others to fall in on themselves." Andrews paused. "It is a mathematical certainty, pure and straightforward. There is no way out." With a hard face, Captain Smith took his hat off and glared at his White Star emblem. "I was to retire after this trip, Mr. Andrews." "Sir?" The shipbuilder was busy going over calculations. "I am 59, Smith chuckled. "A man is to retire when he is my age, when a man can look back on what he has accomplished." Andrews stopped his calculating, paying more attention to what the officer had to say. "I worked so hard to wear this hat, sir. Worked hard my whole life." Smith let out a proud sigh. White Star even gave me the singular honor of mastering each new ship on the maiden voyages. I'll tell you, sir, that is the honor of being a sailor." I admire this man, Andrews thought, sharing the old man's pain. To be able to look back on what he has accomplished with such zeal. Let his death be an honorable one. "A sailor to make a daughter proud, sir," Andrews said. Upon saying those words, Smith's eyes started to fill with tears. Instinctively, his hand patted his coat pocket where he always kept a cigar. Cigars given to him by his daughter before every sea voyage. The captain put his hat back on, regaining his command character. "How long do we have?" Smith asked. Andrews gave the question serious thought. "The ship can stay afloat from 1 to 1.5 hours only." The shipbuilder paused. Unless what?" Andrews shook his head, battling with himself. "That's too crazy a thing to ask." "Enough craziness has happened this night." Smith opened his cabin door, too embarrassed to look Andrews in the eyes. The captain said, "I'm going to the wireless room. Then, for the first time in my life, I'm going to give the order to abandon ship." "How many on board, sir?" Andrews inquired. Smith stood silent for a moment. "Too damn many." The captain left Andrews alone with his blueprints. Again, reaching for his slide rule, Andrews noticed that the ship was starting to list to port. "It has begun," Andrews said. "Dear God in heaven, it has begun." Andrews started to cry. A deck, wireless room, 12:15 a.m. Smith could see the look of confusion on the wireless officer's face. "At ease." Harold Bride stood in the wireless shack dressed in his nightclothes. The young man won the captain's full attention. "Mr. Bride," Smith said with a smile. "Sir?" "When the opportunity arises, change your clothes. Something warm, I should think." "Yes, sir." Smith took a notepad from the room's workbench and set about writing map coordinates. "I want you to start the CQD distress code. We are sinking." "Sinking, sir?" Bride laughed. "Foundering, Mr. Bride," Smith barked. "This is not a comedy. We are done for, sir." The wireless offer stood corrected. Seriousness once more returned to the room. "Our estimated position is 41 minutes 46 seconds north, 50 minutes 14 seconds west. Explain to all who hear that this position is based on old readings. We are sinking by the head. Our passengers are waiting, and that there are not enough lifeboats for all." Smith looked at the two officers. "May God watch over your work." Before Captain could explain further, an enormous explosion of sound echoed through the wireless room. A hot stream of steam and power. "What the hell's that?" Bride shouted, concerned. "Not to worry," Smith reassured. "I have ordered the shutdown of all the engines. We are dead in the water, sir. Our fate is in your hands." Harold Bride and his supervisor John Phillips began their work. The two tapped out metallic dots and dashes over the seas, sending out the Titanic's desperate signal for help. The captain left the two to do their work. He had a serious chore ahead. To tell the passengers. A deck, first class promenade, 12:20 a.m. Dennis Parker was witness to the chaos that had been going on. Awakened from a deep sleep, he was greeted at his door by a rather pleasant-looking steward who told him of talk about an iceberg. Concerned, the captain had asked for all passengers to please put on their life jackets and to report up on deck. After a few minutes of confusion, Parker changed his clothes, drank a cup of coffee the steward was kind enough to leave, and started to search for his life jacket. It took some time to discover just where the cleaning staff of his suite had placed the bloody thing. By accident, Parker found 6 jostled together in his wardrobe closet. He noticed the life jacket's primitive lines, and really, not wishing to wear it, he strapped it around his waist, commenting that the buckles were uncomfortable. Parker discovered that he was not alone in his findings of the jacket. "The damn thing's too ugly, I say." Like a bolt from the blue, the loud female voice caught Parker's attention as he was making his way to the bridge. "Mrs. Brown, I'm sorry," a crewman apologized. Parker's eyes came to rest on Mrs. John J. Brown, an eccentric millionairess he dined with once from Denver, Colorado. Pleased to see a familiar face and not really in a rush to find Andrews, Parker walked toward the little woman who, when she yelled, reminded him of his own grandmother years ago. "I don't care what your opinion is of me, young man," Mrs. Brown pointed out to the steward helping her. "It's a shame these jackets don't come in bright colors. The clash is practically ruining my new outfit." Really not concerned, the steward strapped Mrs. Brown's jacket, moving on to the next set of millionaires. "Yes, Mum, whatever you say." Mrs. Brown said, "With assholes like him in the world, I worry for the future." It was all Parker could do to keep from laughing. Dressed in a colorful feathered cloak and carrying a thick walking stick, Mrs. Brown, or Molly, as she liked to be addressed by her friends, looked the part of a wealthy American. Well-rounded, loud-voiced, and old enough to be his mother, the poor woman still held within her eyes the fire of the early pioneer life. Advanced in age, Parker still believed that Molly had the strength of 10 men. He found her views refreshing, her language vulgar, and her manner lovable. "I see that you've been invited to the party," Parker joked with a smile. Genuinely pleased to see a familiar face, Molly grabbed Parker by the hand, shaking it with glee. "Dennis, where have you been?" "I've been kind of busy, Mrs. Brown." "Mrs. Brown," Molly said, rather insulted. "Call me Molly. Only servants or people I don't like call me Mrs. Brown." "Of course." Molly gave the full deck a worried look. She noticed that the crowd of people had been growing as the clock ticked. She knew something was painfully wrong. Parker could see the worry on her brow, and it in turn was starting to worry him. "To tell the God's truth, Dennis, this is a party I'd just as soon give notice to. What is all of this?" "Got me." "Some dude who rustled me out of bed said something about striking an iceberg or some such thing." "Iceberg," Parker corrected with a smile. Berg. What's the difference?" Molly laughed. "Whatever you call it, it's keeping me from my beauty rest." "You're already beautiful, Molly." A tint of blush entered Molly's cheeks. Parker could tell that although rough around the edges, Mrs. Brown was still a maiden at heart. The woman walked down the deck with Parker, proud to show off her escort. "Just for that?" she giggled. "You can buy me a drink." "Delighted." Bridge, 12:30 a.m. "Gentlemen," Smith stated, "I find myself in a precarious position. I have it on the best authority that this ship is going to founder." "Sir," asked Lightoller, "are you certain?" "I have it from Mr. Andrews himself." "How long do we have?" the second officer asked. "Less than 2 hours, luck willing." The captain nervously walked up and down the massive bridge. "A hard fact is brought to light," Smith pointed out, taking his place by the ship's wheel. "There are not enough lifeboats to hold every person on board." Smith noticed the questions growing in the young officers' eyes. Young officers who, in their puzzlement, were turning toward the older ones hoping for some guidance. Smith wished that he had the advice to give. This was his first disaster as well. He was in virgin territory. The captain wished to carry on, but was interrupted by the presence of Thomas Andrews, who, looking at his folded blueprints, entered the room via the wheelhouse. Smith could see that the young man was going over problems that he could never understand. He felt sorry for the shipbuilder. There seemed to be a flood of demons biting at Andrews' troubled brow, just taunting him to discover a life-saving solution. All the officers turned their attention to the quiet shipbuilder. Andrews realized that he was being stared at, and a look of discomfort crossed the Irishman's face. Smith hated the thoughts swimming in his mind. He hated the idea of being stuck on a ship that wasn't meant to sit on the bottom of the ocean's floor. He hated what he had to do. "We must not create a panic, gentlemen," Smith continued, turning his attention from the shipbuilder. "Therefore, to save those who are worthy, I shall only authorize the immediate evacuation of women and children. We will start with the first class." Several officers grumbled in protest. "Speak your piece," Smith ordered. "Why just first class, sir?" Lightoller asked. "Are not all worthy of the saving?" "Don't you know?" Moody said. "The poor are too poor to take legal action once they are dead." "You will stop that, sir," Smith yelled. Murdoch stepped forward. Right. Men, you've heard the captain. Let's get to work. The first officer sent men out to uncover the Titanic's lifeboats. One by one, the cold stares left the cabin. Thank you, Mr. Murdoch, Smith said with a tired gratitude. They're young, sir. Pay their sarcasm no mind. The captain was left alone. Only he and Andrews were on the bridge. Smith forgot that Andrews was hidden in the shadows of the bridge. He took off his hat and threw it to the floor. The old man began to fight with himself. God in heaven, what have I just ordered my men to do? Smith moaned, fighting back waves of frustration. Hundreds of people trapped below decks, separated by iron gates and locked doors because they were born poor, and I have given the order to ignore their pleas. Smith paused, almost praying for guidance. I have never considered myself a murderer. Dear God, how do I justify the blood left on my hands? Captain Edward John Smith, Commodore of the White Star Line, started to cry. Jesus, what have I done? It is not our fault, Captain, said Andrews, moved. Smith turned to see Andrews looking at him. The shipbuilder's sudden appearance startled the captain. Mr. Andrews, Smith said, rather embarrassed. I'm sorry. I thought that I was alone. Nothing of the kind, Captain. No apologies are needed. Andrews patted the man on the shoulders. I had to cry myself. I'd recommend one to any person who needs it this night. It's a difficult thing, Smith tried to explain, to see the death of one ship. Andrews took a deep breath. The overwhelming sense of failure bit at him as well. This is something we are both going to have to learn to live with, Captain. We are not the cause of the happenings here. We were the victims of magic or science. This was beyond our understandings. Smith accepted this. He bent down to pick up his hat. He wiped off the gold braids on his cap's bill. Smith placed the hat back on his head and straightened his frame. He was once more in control. Let's give a good show. Smith brought Andrews' attention to the bridge's latest visitor. Looks like we have company, Mr. Andrews. Dennis Parker heard all that they had said. He stood at the bridge's entrance, staring blankly at his friend. I think that the two of you should talk. Smith left the bridge to supervise the launching of the lifeboats. 12:35 a.m. Alone, Parker had a chance to study Andrews' face. What's going on here, Thomas? The ship has sustained terrible damage. How terrible? Andrews paused. We're sinking, Dennis. Parker let out a nervous laugh. I'm glad that you're taking it so well, Andrews said, nervously studying Parker's reactions. Tell me that you're joking, Thomas. I wish that I were, Andrews explained. In less than 2 hours, the ship will be making the final plunge. Straight to the bottom. Andrews nodded. Ever heard of a ship going anywhere else? Was this Carray's doing? Parker asked, his voice stressed. Possibly. Parker cursed himself. This is all my fault. Impossible. If I had heeded the warnings, Parker paused. Christ, I have been so stupid. You're stupid, Andrews chuckled ironically. Parker, tired of standing, took a seat on a nearby stool. Thomas, you know how much I hate the water. I always have, ever since I watched my parents die. I know. Andrew's voice was soft. I can't swim. You better learn, old chum. Andrews placed his hands on his friend's shoulders. This ship is sinking, and there are not enough lifeboats. Parker's fear of the water magnified his sense of hearing 100-fold. He could actually hear the cold splashing of the Atlantic Ocean against the Titanic's iron hull, slowly killing the ship an inch at a time. How about a rescue? Andrews rolled up his blueprints and blew out the fire on a nearby lantern. The bridge turned dark. Don't count on a rescue ship anytime soon, my friend. We are at the loneliest spot on the planet. Parker's heart started to race with pure terror. All he could think about was the agony of drowning.